I'm going to be talking about some behaviors now that in some cases, particularly as we get farther down the road in terms of severity, may make you a little bit uncomfortable. And as I do that, I want you to kind of be a gentle observer of yourself and just notice what of this is very difficult for you to hear. Our job is to be a mediator of God's grace. And if hearing some of this kind of behavior makes you so uncomfortable that you're going to be sitting in a room having reactions to it, maybe it's shutting down a little bit yourself, or your eyes get wider, or you say, oh my gosh, how did you do that? I mean, you might want to think about a little bit, trying to check your spirit, because addicts are very intuitive, and they have radar out, and they're going to be in their shame wondering exactly how you're reacting to this. So I'm simply encouraging you to be aware of it. We need to basically ask God to help us be a vehicle or a vessel of His grace. And we need to remember passages of Scripture like, there is no sin that separates us from the love of God. We are all kind of in this, and there is no inequality at the foot of the cross. So with that kind of thought, let me proceed into some of this. I thought it would be interesting, even though St. Paul himself did not necessarily understand the diagnosis of sexual addiction, he was quite concerned about sexual sin. If we have already been through some list as we have, the list that he presents to us in Galatians 5 is an interesting list, don't you think? The acts of the sinful nature are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery, idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. I just thought it would be interesting to present to you a biblical diagnostic list, as we have just finished talking about some of the criteria that we use for the psychiatric world, the medical world, the psychological world. We Christian counselors need to be aware that some of these fruits of the sinful nature are obviously diagnostic types of conditions that we're dealing with people who have alienated themselves from God. It's interesting, isn't it, that the one condition there that Paul starts with is what? Sexual immorality, and the one he ends with on that list are orgies. So obviously sexual sin, and perhaps even sexual addiction back in Paul's time, was something that he dealt with in the churches that he sought to minister to. Well, with that introduction, let me just talk about what has been classified in the sexual addiction community over the years as three different kind of levels, so to speak, of sexual acting out. Now, those of you that know the work of Dr. Patrick Carnes and perhaps some other writers in the field of sexual addiction will recognize that there have been some developments in terms of how Dr. Carnes and others have classified sexual behaviors. When I first got in the field and I became a student of Dr. Carnes and all of his work, and then had the opportunity to work directly with him for 4 years. In his first book, which is still available today, it's called Out of the Shadows, he defined sexual addiction in terms of all the behaviors into three different classifications. He called them level 1, level 2, and level 3. He's kind of gotten away from that a little bit because there is a kind of common misconception that if you look at it in terms of levels, there's a belief that maybe you'll go from level 1 automatically to level 2 behaviors to level 3. And he kind of wanted to get away from that. So let's start talking about what used to be called level 1. I call it building block behaviors. The reason that I call them building block behaviors is that every sex addict I've ever known, whether they're male or female, has done some of these behaviors, particularly the first 3. The first 3 of the list that you'll see on your screen and see in your resource material: fantasy, masturbation, and pornography. These 3 activities, these 3 behaviors, are really kind of what I call the foundation of all sexual addiction. It's not that every sex addict has done pornography. or that every sex addict masturbates. But by far and away, the vast majority of all sex addicts have at some point done all three of these things. The cornerstone of that foundation is the first one that you'll see on your list, and that's fantasy. Fantasy is simply the things that we think about in our mind, and it could be a variety of thoughts. Certainly it would be any past sexual activities that we have actually engaged in ourselves that are stored in our memory and that can be pulled up at the drop of a hat and remembered. In that also would be any pornography that we've seen. That would be a form of past sexual activity that we've actually engaged in, looking at all of that material. Sadly, as I've talked to a number of neurophysiologists and scientists and psychiatrists and so forth around the country about stored memory, memory does not ever go away. Short of having some kind of surgical intervention into the memory center of your brain, you're not ever going to get rid of that. So what makes recovery from sexual addiction so challenging is that all the thoughts, all the pictures, all the activities that we've ever been involved with are stored in our memory. Our fantasy life, in terms of what we think about, can drag that up in a heartbeat. And certainly the addicts that we work with are quite capable of doing it. And a lot of times what they'll complain about is that these thoughts are like pop-ups. They just kind of creep into their brain without them necessarily consciously inviting that to happen. So various stimuli could come along and bring up all these old memories. For example, one of the guys that I was working with last week was out shopping with his wife. He had had some affairs. These two have been in couples recovery and I'm happy to say are restoring their relationship. But since this guy had affairs with women in the past, they were just shopping out at one of our department stores and they walked through the cosmetic and perfume section, and he happened to smell the fragrance that was commonly worn by one of his old affair partners. As he and his wife were having a nice time that day, just walking through that section, just smelling that fragrance brought him back to all the memories, all the scenes, all the activity that he'd done with that woman. That's how easily fantasy can creep into our brains. Stored memory, stored images that are part of that memory can come into our lives so quickly. Fantasy is not only about historical activity, but fantasy can be about imagined activity that we'd like to see happen in the future. One of the things we can do is take all the images we've seen or done and we can kind of mix them or match them. We've obviously engaged in a lot of different kind of things, so most addicts that I've ever known are incredibly creative, and in their imagination they can make composites of what they'd like to see happen in the future. The interesting part about that for me is that years ago I was talking to a guy who actually had come to the Lord, received Christ, and is now pursuing a life of purity and fidelity. But in his acting out days, he owned one of the largest production companies of pornography in the world. And what he said that the pornography industry frequently does when they're creating new DVDs or videos or whatever they are, is they take lots of different scenes from lots of different places that they've filmed and they mix them and match them and they just put out new films. Basically in those days, he said that his company cranked out 200 different videos a week. Well, you know, our fantasy life can be like that. We can crank out, you know, videos in our head of things that are kind of composites or imagined activities that we'd like to see happen. Now for now, just hold on to the thought, because we'll talk about it more later when we talk about healing from sexual addiction. Fantasy, being the cornerstone, is an attempt that we have, I believe, to heal old wounds. So let me just kind of tantalize you a little bit with the thought that when you're taking a history, when you're assessing for sexual addiction, don't be afraid of talking with your people about what their fantasy life has been like. To me, fantasies are a messenger of the soul, and the soul is basically trying to create an answer to the deepest desires of the heart. A sex addict who is confused about the relationship between love and nurture will be turning to sexual activity to get his or her needs met for love and nurture. So it becomes important, I think, to understand the fantasy life of an addict, not to get into graphic details, not to ask for specifics, but simply to say what have been some of the themes so that you can begin to listen to the heart of the addict, where they are lonely, where they are desperate for love and nurture. And basically, one of the things that can happen when we treat sexual addiction is that if we teach addicts what are healthier solutions to their heart's desires, then their fantasy life will disappear. Again, we'll talk more about that in another segment, but for now, remember that fantasy life is incredibly important. It's the cornerstone for all sex addicts as far as I'm concerned. I've never known a sex addict who doesn't get into incredible amounts of fantasy life. The second thing is masturbation, and masturbation is an activity that is not necessarily abnormal, meaning that a lot of people have tried it in their life. I think a lot of kids, a lot of adolescents, certainly a lot of teenagers experiment at some point with touching themselves genitally, experiencing the pleasurable sensation of that. The developmental psychologist would tell us that for a child to self-explore in this way is not abnormal. What is abnormal is when a person gets locked in on this activity as the only way that they're getting touched, the only way that they're getting that kind of pleasurable sensation. And believe it or not, masturbation in itself can become one of the most addictive activities that I know, and certainly, again, part of the foundation of sexual addiction. Maybe it's not a bad time in this point in the teaching to address one of my most frequently asked questions, and that is, do you as a Christian counselor, as a pastor, do you think masturbation is inherently evil? Behind that question is always the biblical knowledge that the whole idea of masturbation is never in the lists of sexual sin that appear in both the Old and the New Testament. So there are a lot of people out there, and certainly a lot of Christian singles deal with the issue of, is it okay for me to masturbate or not? Well, I think we can find an answer to this in the Bible, and it's basically in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, where Jesus talks about lusting in your heart. You know, he says, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you, anyone who lusts after another woman in their heart so much as commits adultery. The answer to whether masturbation is a problem or not, again, goes back to our cornerstone, which was what? Fantasy. So in other words, in order to masturbate, you're going to have to think about something. And if you're thinking about something that's sinful in its nature, then masturbation at that level, because of what you're thinking about, automatically, I feel, becomes sinful in and of itself. So in other words, you might even separate out and say, well, the mechanical act of it, maybe that's not as bad, but what you think about when you're doing it, that's where we really get ourselves into trouble. But I think it also goes a little bit deeper than that, and I'm going to have to get a little crass and more specific than I sometimes like to get in order to explain this part. But when you are genitally stimulating yourself with your hands, or in some cases with other objects like vibrators or whatever it is, you are basically training your genital area to respond to certain kinds of stimulation. So for a man, for example, to masturbate, and that activity may take a minute, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're basically training themselves to be excited, to go through the full sexual response cycle and have an orgasmic release, and the whole thing does not take very long. Basically, when we think about marital sexuality, the relationship in a sacred one-flesh union between a man and a wife, that's to be mutually satisfying for both partners. That kind of quick training does not work very well in terms of normal, healthy sexuality between a husband and wife. Another part of that is that for men particularly, I think, when they are masturbating excessively, they are basically training themselves not to be satisfied with the stimulation of genital sexuality. So if you look at it that way, I think one of the things we need to be teaching young people too, and certainly our Christian singles, is that if you have a vision in your heart of having a fulfilling, healthy sexual relationship with your spouse in marriage, masturbation is a habit that can take you out of satisfaction with that relationship. So if again your vision is to have healthy sexuality, you might want to take masturbation out of your life experience. Certainly for addicts, given the neurochemical tolerance that develops in the brain. So in other words, even the fantasy and the activity in masturbation can lead to a very definite neurochemical tolerance in the brain. You're going to, over time, want more of the same thing to achieve the same effect. It's going to get worse and worse and worse over time. I remember one of my favorite cases from years ago. This goes back to the days when I myself was in active addiction and I didn't necessarily know how to help this lady. I feel really bad about it. Remember, I talked earlier on about wanting to do a recall. This is one of those cases where I would say that that's true. This was an 86-year-old pastor's wife. Her husband was long since retired. But when they got married in their first year, over 60 years ago, this man, in their first month of marriage, became impotent, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons that I never did understand, because strangely enough, he wouldn't come in for counseling. But he basically could not have sex for the next 60 years with his wife. They never had children, obviously. Whenever she'd kind of talk to him about being lonely, about not having children or not having a sexual relationship in their marriage, he would quote scripture and tell her she shouldn't worry about it, and wasn't he a good husband, and all of that kind of thing. Well, as you can imagine, given the point we're on, this woman, being a Christian, being a pastor's wife, did not want to go off and do other crazy things. And for one thing, this happened back in the 1920s, so there wasn't a lot of information, pornography, or other things out there. So she did discover masturbation. For the next 60 years, she went from masturbating once the first year to, by the time I got to know her in my counseling practice, she was masturbating 4 or 5 times a day. And you see there a 60-year pattern of escalation, and all that she ever did was masturbate. She had a huge fantasy life going on, none of which she actually acted out with another person, only with herself. Some of you, in hearing that story, might even be thinking, well, why would we blame her, given the husband's insensitivity to his impotence and the lack of children, and his spiritual self-righteousness and all those kinds of things. And so, while we shouldn't be judgmental, we still can look at this and say, this woman was ramping herself up over a 60-year period. She was incredibly lonely. She was incredibly isolated and alienated. And she was basically using masturbation as a false substitute for healthy relationships. I can also tell you that her masturbation habit was so profound that she did enough damage to herself over the years that it required surgical intervention right before she came in to see me for treatment. Well, that's an example of how masturbation in and of itself can get out of control. The third thing is pornography, and pornography is something that we need to take a little time about because there are so many forms of it today. You heard in my story at the front part of this segment that I started looking at pornographic magazines back when I was 11 years old. Well, if you look at the progression of pornography in my life, you can basically trace the progression of the availability of pornography in our country over the next 25 years. One of the things that happened in the 70s is that the pornographers became capable of putting all this filth onto videotapes. Now we have it available to us on DVDs and other electronic medias. But by far and away, the greatest problem we're having today with pornography is pornography that's available to us on the internet. By the time even some of you are watching this series, I can only imagine what the prevalence of this will be, but be assured of the fact that pornography on the internet is the #1 source of business on the internet. In other words, it's the leading seller on the internet. There are billions of sites. There are billions of dollars being made on the internet. And basically, one of the things we talk about with internet pornography that is so important to realize is that back in my day, I had to go to some drugstore. I had to steal it. I had to go to some area, some X-rated bookstore eventually, go to some little isolated room in a video store, whatever it was. Today, from the anonymity of your own home, you can access the vilest and most filthy forms of material there is. So one of the features of internet pornography that makes it so powerful is that it is supposedly accessible. I mean, any place you have wireless internet, in the middle of the ocean, on a cruise ship. One of my clients came back and was into pornography on a cruise ship, wireless internet service the ship provided. He was on pornographic sites every night on the cruise. I mean, it's all over the place. It's accessible. We think it's anonymous, meaning, we don't have to go to these dark, vile places to get it. We can get it in our own homes. It's anonymous, supposedly. The fact is it really isn't, because there's so many different ways we can monitor this activity. But in the mind of an addict, one of the things that makes internet pornography so powerful is that it is supposedly anonymous. And then there's so much free stuff out there on the internet. Basically what the pornographers would consider lost leaders. They'll entice you with all kind of free stuff. Basically they're wanting you to give them your credit card number so that you can access deeper sites into the website. But the AAA engine of internet pornography is its accessibility, its anonymity, and its affordability. Well, sadly, one of the number one sources that our kids are getting hooked into this is on school computers, it's on public library computers. And the pornographers in the early days of this website craziness, they bought up a lot of popular domain names. So, you can go to various sites that have very popular product names. Coca-Cola.com for a long time, for example, was a pornography site. Coca-Cola had to buy its own domain name back as a website for $3 million a number of years ago. Whitehouse.com is still a pornography site. One of the dangerous things for all of us to be aware of is how inadvertently many of us can actually trip into pornographic websites on the internet. And that's how a lot of people are getting sucked in. The statistics are very sad that 66 or almost 2/3 of all Christian men struggle with pornography on the internet at some level. 40% of all pastors have struggled with it. And one survey I saw that Christianity Today did, it revealed that of that 40% of pastors who said they struggled with internet pornography, about 1/3 of them had actually looked at it in the last month. It's an epidemic. It's a part of the spiritual warfare that's going on in our culture. And as Christian counselors, pastors, therapists, or those yourself out there watching this, struggling with this, we have got to do a lot more to protect ourselves from the evils and dangers of the internet. It is incredibly enticing, and it behooves all of us to have a variety of forms of protection available to us. And we'll be talking about some of that on another segment when we get to treatment. Pornography is out there. It's available like it's never been before in the history of the universe. And I had one guy in the month of February spend $75,000 on accessing pornography on the internet. People are spending incredible amounts of money on this. This gets into that negative consequence definition of sexual addiction that I talked about earlier. Prostitution is in this first level. It's part of the kind of foundation. It's at level 1. It's a building block. In my story, you heard that there was some involvement with that. But one of the things, again, that we just need to be aware of when we think about this category, prostitution is one of the oldest professions there is. It's certainly talked about in the Old Testament, certainly talked about some in the New Testament. It's been around forever, so it's not a new phenomenon that we're talking about here. But one of the things that now makes this so much more incredibly dangerous is that prostitutes are now advertising their services, selling themselves on the internet. Here we are back to the internet and all its dangers again. One of the things that is a sociological phenomenon with this that I think is so incredibly dangerous is that prostitutes who historically have had to use massage services, massage parlors, entertainment services, maybe a pimp on the street, they are now able to avoid all of that, what we call middleman type of activity, by just advertising themselves on the internet. There are so many prostitutes today that have their own websites. And basically, through virtual reality technology like video cameras and who knows what's coming down the road technologically speaking, you can actually engage yourself in chat, in video presentation with a prostitute online. So these days, you don't have to go to some red light district. You don't have to call up some escort service, 800 or 900 number, to engage in this. You can actually go onto the internet and set up appointments, set up activities, engage in it right there, right then. Prostitution is incredibly available, and there are lots and lots of people making lots and lots of money, and believe it or not, it's getting incredibly worse as we speak. Again, just a point to ponder about some of the protections that we in the Christian community need to bring into our homes to guard against this kind of activity. Again, one of my clients, one of my more famous clients, told me that he spent $3 million engaging in prostitution in about a 10-year space of time. That's an extreme example. My average client has spent, though, thousands of dollars engaging in this kind of activity. Those that have done prostitution, it is incredibly financially debilitating. I think the saddest case that I ever treated, a very fine man, he's given me permission to use his story, but he was a pastor of a very successful church, got hooked into prostitution, started putting prostitution charges on his credit card, and that's another thing prostitutes are willing to do. They all have credit card availability. And he ramped himself up with about 7 or 8 different credit cards to having spent over $45,000. Well, his salary as a pastor, he wasn't able to pay that off very easily, so he started robbing banks. This man actually, as a pastor, a fine man, a husband and a father, got so hooked into pornography, didn't know what to do, who to talk to, and actually committed 7 cases of armed robbery and eventually was arrested and wound up in jail for 7 years. You know, we talked about consequences, even legal consequences. Well, prostitution, if left untreated, can lead to all kind of crazy things. The next category in this basic level 1 is affairs. Now, interestingly enough to me, that's a word that most people have some stereotype of what the word affair means. Well, affair has a whole continuum of activity. It could be that you have one relationship. You think even it's an emotional and spiritual friendship and relationship and connection, and it's a love type match that you pursue for long periods of time. That could be an affair. On one end of the spectrum, on another end of the spectrum would be those things we call one-night stands, where you just meet somebody in a bar or some social setting, you go home with them that night. Well, there are 2 ends of a spectrum, where you really know a person, feel emotionally and spiritually connected to that person, or you don't know them at all and you don't care to know them at all, you just want to have sex with them. In between is a whole lot of activity, but basically the category of affairs means you've crossed what we call the flesh line. You've actually engaged in some form of sexual activity with another person outside of marriage. Anything outside of marriage that is a matter of a direct physical sexual connection falls under this category of having an affair. Let me say something right now before I move on. I've never known an affair, and I've known over 2,000 sex addicts, and I've treated a lot of men and women who've had affairs. And one of the things you're going to hear is that, this is my long-lost soulmate. This is my best friend. I'm not sure how I could give this up. One of the great mythologies of affairs of any kind is that you've really found the magic person for you. It's all a myth. It's all a lie. I've never known an affair that was a true love connection at the deepest level of heart, soul, and spirit. The only way to have that kind of covenantal love is in a committed, one flesh, sacred union that we call marriage. Now, also you'll see on your list something that is called anonymous sex. When I first got involved in treating sexual addiction, we used to think that this only belonged to the homosexual community. And certainly in the homosexual community, it's likely for some people who are sexually addicted to go to bars, go to rest stops, go to public parks, go to places where gay people are known to connect in these ways, and meet somebody. They don't talk to them, they don't ask them their name, they just go to cars, they go to rooms, they go to various places, and they act out sexually and have sex with this person, and they never say a word. Or they certainly don't know each other's names, or they don't certainly have any kind of emotional connection whatsoever. Now, again, from those early days when I was in the field to now, we're seeing this phenomenon ramp itself into the heterosexual community as well. In other words, there are many, many people who go to bars, go to places, even in colleges these days, and just engage in recreational sex, supposedly recreational, with people they don't really know. In fact, one of the saddest phenomenons for me lately has been to see, even on Christian college campuses, some of our bright young Christian minds engaging in forms of sexual activity, not intercourse, that they think are basically okay as long as it's not intercourse and it's not necessarily for the purpose of connecting. There was one Christian university I talked to a number of years ago that had discovered that during the course of the 4 years they had these kids in Christian college, 50% of them had acted out sexually, not obviously in the union of marriage. This is a very sad thing, and it is getting worse again in our culture. Well, that's level 1 types of behaviors. And again, even as we get into these are some very painful things to talk about. Let's now go to level 2. The first one is fetish behaviors. Fetishes is sometimes a really hard thing to kind of fully understand, and the reason is there's so many different kinds of fetish activities. Basically, a fetish activity is using some kind of sexual behavior, not marital, genital sexuality, to ramp up your sense of sexual excitement. It might be using an object or paraphernalia, sex toys of some kind, in order to, again, increase sexual excitement. Now, again, we can get into things, too wild to describe in this series. When I first got involved in the field, though, there were fad activities that were going on, and you'll see this on the internet in forms of pornography. I hope you don't see it actually, but we can culturally perceive that there are various fad activities that somehow overtake the sexually addicted populations around the world, and certain things in pornography on the internet get emphasized from time to time. Fetish activities are like that. They can be fad activities, and again, I'm not going to go into real specifics. When I first got involved in the field, we had a problem in teenage and young adult populations with something we called autoerotic asphyxiation. It's still something that we occasionally run into. It's not as popular today as I think it used to be, but we went through a phase of time where it seemed like a lot of people were doing this. Basically what that is tying something around your neck to kind of cut off the circulation to your brain. And the experience of that is when you do that, it kind of intensifies sexual pleasure and excitement. So there were obviously cases where there were people who were basically strangling themselves or getting close to strangling themselves while they were masturbating or engaging in sexual activity, even with a partner. And again, they were after that sexual high. Well, unfortunately, and many of you know this, some of these people who were masturbating, doing this by themselves, actually got to a point where it got out of control and they actually hanged themselves or strangled themselves. I mean, this is how deadly and serious some of these fetish activities can get. If we were to talk about sadomasochistic activity, bondage activities, any of those kinds of acting out behaviors, that would technically fall into this category. The use of objects, people sticking things into various parts of their body, this would fall into this category. And again, even as I'm talking about this right now in front of the camera, I mean, my spirit just gets sick thinking about so many of the stories. But again, we need to remember the words of Paul. There is no sin that separates us from the love of God. I clearly remember a group that we led down at one of our workshops in Nashville. And there were 2 men in that group who did a sexual behavior so bizarre, it's beyond description. And, I had never heard of this before, this particular kind of activity. But there were 2 guys that the Holy Spirit, I believe, brought in that group that day whose behavior around that was identical. Now, you tell me, is that not God at work? And that not the teaching that I've mentioned from Paul? There is no sin that separates us from the love of God, and there is no sin that's not common to man. So in other words, the Holy Spirit on that day provided 2 guys doing an incredibly bizarre behavior, and God brought them into the same group. The next one is exhibitionism. That's a little bit easier to understand. It's anytime you engage in some form of nudity where you're showing yourself to someone in a nude position or posture that hasn't invited that to be the case. We used to think it was the guy, going around at the window. But today in our culture, we can do it in so many other different ways. One of my, this is not going to sound right, one of my favorite places where I hear about this happening is at shopping malls. Some of the clothing stores. Last Christmas, I was at a clothing store buying something for Debbie, and this was one of these more popular places. And one of the things that was fascinating for me to observe is that in the dressing rooms, they had become co-ed in there, number one, which wouldn't have been the case when I was a young person. And the doors were louvered, the doors covered you kind of part way. And there were girlfriends and boyfriends, not married, that were in there kind of trying on clothes together and seeing how they looked and fit and all that kind of thing. There were lines of people to get in. And basically the activity there was kind of exhibitionistic just in its very nature. Well, exhibitionists can be very creative. One of my favorite examples of this was a female sex addict that we treated in Nashville. She was a truck driver, drove an 18-wheeler, and she would basically drive down the highway topless, and basically she would also exhibit herself to passing motorists and other trucks. And she had a little thing going where she would toot her horn and get somebody's attention, and there she'd be sitting topless. Well, you know, creative, nonetheless. I mean, it's a form of activity where it was getting worse and worse for her all the time. Well, think about creativity and where you might run into this kind of activity. And basically, sometimes I think we reward people in our current culture for being a little bit on the exhibitionistic side. There's a double standard that sometimes still exists, and that is we might say to women who are exhibitionistic, you know, congratulations, that's really nice what you're wearing, whereas if a man were to do that, we might not be so encouraging. But whatever the case, exhibitionism is showing yourself publicly in some way to get a sense of sexual satisfaction for yourself by doing that. The next one is obviously related, and that's voyeurism. Voyeurism is basically trying to look at someone, undressing them even with your eyes, going to places where you can catch glimpses. You know, and culture has popularized this. There was a movie years ago called Porky's. It's that old locker room scene where the boys in their adolescent testosteronal nature are trying to catch a look at the girls in the shower. Well, you know, culture popularizes this, but it's basically the idea that we're going to get a look at nudity or maybe even sexual activity, and we have not been invited to do that in any healthy way. Well, it's not just the guy that's going around the neighborhoods at night looking into windows. It could be a guy that's in that shopping mall that I already talked about, hanging out in certain sections, hoping to see women try on clothes. It could be going to various beaches. It could be going to strip clubs. That's a form of voyeurism. It could be going to nudist camps or clubs. A variety of different ways that we could go and try to get a look at nudity or sexual activity. That would all be under this category of voyeurism. The next one is indecent liberties. Indecent liberties is basically touching someone and getting a sense of sexual high from doing that, and that person hasn't invited the touch, or maybe in some cases doesn't even know that that's what's going on. Now this ranges, I remember Debbie and I being on our honeymoon over in Europe, and we went to Italy, and you know, Italian men are kind of good at coming up from behind and grabbing you. We used to call it, in common parlance, copying a feel. Well, you know, that's a form of an indecent liberty. And in Italy, somewhat culturally accepted, I guess. That you know about, that's happening, you feel uncomfortable about it, but since everyone is kind of giggling or laughing, at least over in Italy, you know, no one does anything about it. But when it happens over here, you know, we can get ourselves into more trouble about it. But generally speaking, people who engage in indecent liberties are doing it, and the other person doesn't necessarily know that they're doing it. Hugging at certain levels for certain people can be a form of indecent liberty. We had a case of a priest who was, by his own definition, calling himself the hugging priest. He would hug everyone coming out of church on Sunday morning. The women finally had to report him to the bishop because they were feeling really uncomfortable with this hugging. Now, I'm not wanting to make anybody watching this self-conscious about giving somebody else a hug. Remember, an indecent liberty is when you touch someone and you get a sense of sexual high from doing that, even though you're not touching them in a sexual area. Another example was a missionary we worked with who used to work in one of these metropolitan areas over in Europe where they had a subway system. He'd ride the subway during the congested times, not because he had any business he was trying to get to, just because the subway cars were so crowded that everyone was kind of pressed together, and for him, being pressed against, for him, attractive women was a very exciting thing, and he was doing it morning and afternoon during the commute times. That is indecent liberties. Touching people, whether it's even just getting pressed together, perhaps even on an elevator, and you're getting a sense of sexual high from doing that. The next one is a category that maybe we should expand a little bit. It's having sex on the phone or cyber sex. Back in the days when I first got involved in this field, there were all these emerging 800 and 900 numbers where you could get into sex talk with people. Sometimes you paid for that. Sometimes you were hooked into party lines and chat lines where people were talking sexually. Well, that's obviously ramped into all the different cyber sex opportunities, the chat rooms where sexual talk and chat goes on, connections are actually made, and that form of activity. But anytime you talk to a person sexually, technically that's in this category, maybe sexual joking, sexual teasing. I don't want to step on anyone's toes here, but many of us, I know this was true for me, when I would tell a sexual joke, a little bit off color, a little bit racy, maybe even at church, and everyone would kind of giggle and laugh and feel uncomfortable, but they never let you know that. That's kind of a form of chatting, talking, sexual humor that gets a person a sense of sexual high to a certain extent. Obviously, with the internet, we've ramped this into an art form. There are, again, chat rooms dedicated to every kind of sexual fetish activity there is. Gay people have their own chat rooms. People devoted to certain kinds of activities have their own chat rooms. You can basically be online in 30 seconds and talking about just about anything you want to. Sometimes this leads to exchanging phone numbers and talking on the phone and being sexual on the phone. Sometimes it leads to actually meeting people, and then we're back in category one where you're having some level of an affair. The next category is incredibly hard to talk about because, again, this is an area that shocks our sensibilities to think about this one. But again, this is one in which the addicts who are engaged in this are incredibly shameful about this kind of activity. And I'm sad to say it's very common. Basically, just to be definitionally correct, this is sex with an animal. I used to not begin to understand it at all, and this was not an activity, thanks be to God, that I engaged in. But I don't know about you, but if you've ever had a family pet, we had a dog. Dog's name was Barkley. We bought Barkley when I got home from treatment. This was the Nana for our 3 kids. This was like that dog in the movie Peter Pan. It just helped to raise all 3 of our children. Barkley was part of the family. One of the things that was true with Barkley, she was always sad to see you go and always glad to see you come home. Unconditional love that only a pet can give. Now, if you take that experience, and I remember when we had to put Barkley to sleep, it was one of the saddest days of my life. A member of the family was leaving us, and even now talking about it, I recognize a sense of sadness about Barkley, our family dog, a member of our family. Well, if you think about an addict who is getting ramped into various things with their addiction, and a pet is a very loving thing, and an addict confuses sex with love and nurture, and they're not getting touched in any other way, or they're feeling sorry for themselves, it's accessible. Pets are there, and they're going to not necessarily say no. So, again, as we're talking about this, it's a hard one to talk about, but there are lots of people that are that lonely, that into their addiction, that they wind up engaging in sex with animals. And I would tell you, one of the saddest things to me about the internet is that you can see this activity portrayed in the vilest of forms all over the world. There are pornographic magazines and websites devoted to sex with animals. I'm going to stop talking about it at this point, but again, my encouragement is with any of these things, when you hear this kind of stuff, remember with a fetish, with any of these activities, exhibitionism, voyeurism, indecent liberties, you're dealing with a person who is in so much pain, so starved for love, nurture, and attention that they have turned to the most bizarre of activities in order to get the deep desires of their heart met. Let's go on to level 3, and it doesn't get easier. In this level of activity, I generally refer to it as sexually offending behaviors. Obviously, the first one that we would think about would be any form of rape. Now, rape happens when we use physical force to engage in sexual activity. That's obviously totally illegal and has severe criminal penalties associated with that. One of the things I want to make sure you understand in terms of diagnosis, assessment, and so forth of sexual addiction is that not every person who commits rape as a felony is a sexual addict. In fact, the studies have been fairly clear. There's been a number of studies with incarcerated populations of sex offenders who are rapists, and the statistics in all these different prisons have been the same. About 50% of incarcerated sex offenders also have sexual addiction. So sexual addiction could be part of the profile of a sex offending person. And another point that I want to be very clear about is that the percentage of sex addicts who would ever graduate in that factor of sex addiction getting worse over time to this kind of activity is fairly rare. The reason is because in activities of rape, there has to be other forms of emotional pathology present. Rape is a violent activity. It's a lot about anger and control, and sex addiction could be part of it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, there may be prison chaplains out there watching this training series. Well, if you're working at all with sex offenders, it might be that you have to assess for sexual addiction. And if that's in fact the case, some of the other activities that we've already talked about may be definitely a part of that profile. The next one is incest, and that's sex with someone you're related to biologically. And that can occur. Kids sometimes get involved with this, and we wouldn't consider that felonious behavior, but it could be very problematic and lead to more difficult behaviors later on. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Talking to Your Kids About Sex. I'd encourage you at some point to look at that, because it's about a lifetime of conversations, and one of the conversations we need to have with children is about sex play, sex experimentation, getting involved with their own brothers and sisters, cousins, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, we also know that the most common time this occurs is when a relative who's older, bigger, stronger engages in sex with a son or daughter, with a nephew or niece, with a grandchild. I've had any number of cases of grandfathers who've been involved with their granddaughters, or in some cases grandsons. This is an incredibly damaging kind of behavior, as we all know. It could be, and it's more common for this one where incest takes place, for sexual addiction to be a feature of that activity. The next one would be to molest a child, and that means you have sex as an adult, you're over 18, with a child, technically any person, depending on the state, either under 16 or under 18. This is obviously, again, a criminal behavior. This gets you into all kind of legal difficulties. But it's basically using your power as an adult to engage in sex with a vulnerable minor. And as many of you know, there have been movements around, sometimes in Europe, to say that what's the problem with an adult being sexual with a teenager or even a 12 or 13-year-old? Maybe that's part of a loving relationship. You know, I have never myself personally known that to be healthy in any way, certainly outside the bounds of God's commandments. Molestation is a problem that we've seen even in the Christian church. It's something that incredibly has the power to damage a church, to damage a congregation, to damage many, many other people. Finally, one of the categories is difficult for me to talk about, but it's certainly prevalent and it's certainly out there, is when you use the authority of your position in life to engage in sex with someone who is vulnerable to that authority. So in other words, a pastor who has sex with a parishioner, those two people might even consider that it's a matter of mutual consent, because they're both adults. It's not molestation, it's not incest, it's not rape, but the person who's the parishioner is somehow under the influence of the pastor, who, as we all know, is an authority figure. And the feeling out there, particularly in the clinical community, is that for a parishioner to consent to being sexual with a pastor, it's more or less like an incestuous situation, because the parishioner, even though they're an adult, has the feeling of childlike trust in the pastor. The pastor is a parent figure. Well, this is why some states have criminalized, in other words, made it a felony for a pastor to be sexual with a parishioner. In the state of Minnesota, where Debbie and I live, a pastor who is convicted of having sex with a parishioner will go to jail for a mandatory 1-year sentence. Well, it doesn't have to be pastors and parishioners. I don't mean to pick on that. It could be therapists, it could be doctors, it could be lawyers, it could be teachers, it could be employers. Anyone who has emotional authority over another person, maybe even in the case of pastors, spiritual authority over a person, if the trust in that authority leads a person to consent to sex, it's still something that we call authority rape. Well, that's a difficult one to talk about, because many people, even in the Christian community, have slipped into that and been involved in that, and it's a very harmful, damaging, painful thing to experience. Well, that's a rather long and difficult list, isn't it? And again, the reason to talk about those things is to kind of increase your awareness of the wide range of activities that are a part of what you might encounter if you open your spirit to being available to help in sex addiction. I would tell you that Debbie and I right now run a counseling center where we live, and about 75% of the people we treat have been involved primarily in those first 3 things that we talked about: fantasy, pornography, and masturbation. So chances are, for the most part, if you're open and willing to try to help with sexual addiction, those will be the activities that you will see. But then again, there are some other activities down the road which can be rather difficult to hear. Sexual activity, whatever it is, however bizarre, however perverted it is, it's always about the pain that the person is in. They are lonely, they are isolated, they are angry, anxiety-ridden, depressed. They may be trauma survivors, as we'll see, and because of that incredible pain, they've turned to incredible activities in their life to cope with that pain. If you keep in front of you whatever stories you're hearing about sexual activity, the amount of pain the person is in, that will help you know how to lead them toward healthier solutions.